Uh, I learned a long time ago that the battlefield exposes every illusion faster than any briefing room ever could. In Iraq, in the Gulf, and across every training range I've ever walked, the battlefield had one rule. It doesn't care what you believe. It only cares what you can sustain. In Ukraine today, that simple truth has returned with a vengeance. And it's doing so through a weapon that defines the end game more clearly than any diplomatic statement or Western promise. The Russian glide bomb, what's unfolding now is not a mystery, nor is it sudden. It is the inevitable result of a military that has lost the skies, the initiative, and the logistical depth required to survive modern high-intensity war. When Ukraine lost its last meaningful air defense umbrella, it lost the war. That may sound blunt, but war is blunt. When Russian aircraft can operate outside the range of Ukrainian missiles, drop 250 kilogram, 500 kilogram, or 1500 kilogram, and now even 3,000 kilogram glide bombs from safe standoff distances, the entire front becomes a shooting gallery. I've studied air power my entire career, and I can say without hesitation, there is no army on earth that can survive sustained bombardment from above without the ability to contest the skies. The Ukrainians can't contest anything now. Every position they build is temporary. Every trench becomes a coffin. The moment a Russian Su-34 releases a bomb that glides silently for dozens of kilometers before vaporizing an entire grid square. The West doesn't want to admit this because it undermines the narrative they've built around Ukrainian resilience, but resilience without air defense is simply a slower death. Russia has mastered the operational rhythm of this war. They advance only when they choose, not because they need ground, but because each step forward comes after the defenders have already been destroyed. I've watched enough footage, examined enough reports, and listened to enough testimony to know exactly how this works. The bomb hits, the position ceases to exist, and Russian infantry moves through the debris without resistance. Then it happens again, and again, and again. This is not maneuver warfare. This is industrial killing, and Russia is conducting it with a level of precision and patience that the West never prepared for. People keep asking whether Ukraine is approaching collapse. That question is outdated. Ukraine is already in collapse. We're simply watching the military consequences play out in slow motion. The glide bombs aren't just destroying positions, they're destroying the logic of Ukrainian defense. You cannot rotate troops when every rotation point is targeted. You cannot reinforce units when every assembly area is mapped and bombed. You cannot hold ground when every trench system is registered for demolition. Glide bombs aren't a weapon of breakthrough. They're a weapon of inevitability. The battlefield does not lie, and right now it is telling us that Ukraine can no longer generate the combat power needed to resist Russia's methodical advance. The end game has begun, not because Russia is moving fast, but because Ukraine has nothing left with which to survive what comes next. When a military reaches that point, collapse is not a possibility, it is a schedule. Glide bombs are not new weapons. I trained on their principles decades ago, and any serious Air Force understands the physics behind them. What has changed in Ukraine is not the bomb itself, but the environment into which it is released. A glide bomb is only as effective as the airspace it operates in when the enemy cannot meaningfully contest that airspace, the weapon becomes something far more consequential, a tool of systematic battlefield erasure. And that is exactly what Russia has created over Ukraine. When an Su-34 or Su-35 launches a Fab 500 M62 fitted with guidance modules, it doesn't need to cross the forward line of troops or expose itself to Ukrainian fire. It simply releases, turns away, and lets gravity, glide kits, and inertial guidance do the rest. The Ukrainians have nothing that can reach back at that aircraft, nothing that can intercept the bomb, and nothing that can rebuild faster than Russia can destroy. People want to imagine these bombs as blunt instruments, huge, destructive but indiscriminate. That's not what they are anymore. Over the last 2 years, Russia has refined its targeting through reconnaissance drones, counter battery radars, and electronic warfare networks. Every position the Ukrainians occupy is mapped, confirmed, and cataloged. By the time a glide bomb is released, and the Russians know exactly what they're hitting, a trench line, they've already suppressed an ammunition point. They've already geolocated, or a battalion headquarters that has exhausted its ability to relocate. The bomb isn't the first blow, it's the final one. And once that final blow is delivered, the Ukrainian defenders either die where they stand or fall back into another position that is already queued for destruction. This is why the Western debate about sending F-16 seconds is delusional. An aircraft built in the 1,970 seconds, even with upgrades, cannot survive in an environment where Russians 400 seconds S300V 4S, Buck M 3S, and layered short-range systems create overlapping kill zones. Ukraine doesn't just lack jets, it lacks the integrated air defense network required to make jets relevant. A pilot who has never flown against a high-end adversary isn't going to rewrite the laws of physics by showing up in a legacy platform. He's going to die. The glide bombs will continue to fall, and Ukrainian ground forces will continue to absorb impacts they cannot mitigate. That's the logic of air dominance. Once you have it, everything else becomes a formality. I've seen this dynamic before in Iraq, where American aircraft dismantled fixed positions with ease. But even then, our opponents retained some ability to shoot back, to relocate, to survive the initial onslaught. Ukraine doesn't have that luxury. What makes the Russian glide bomb campaign so devastating is that it operates within a strategic framework designed to annihilate Ukraine's ability to regenerate combat power. The bomb is only one part of a larger system. Russian industry mass produces the munitions. Russian engineers fit them with increasingly reliable guidance kits. Russian pilots operate under protective air defense umbrellas, and Russian ground forces coordinate their advances on the assumption that the enemy in front of them will already be dead or fleeing. War is ultimately an equation. Ukraine's equation no longer balances. Russia can produce more bombs than Ukraine can shoot down. Russia can destroy more fortifications than Ukraine can build. And Russia can eliminate more battalions than Ukraine can mobilize. Glide bombs simply accelerate the arithmetic, stripping away whatever defensive coherence might remain. This is why the front is not collapsing in spectacular fashion. It is collapsing the way a structure collapses after its load-bearing walls have been removed predictably, progressively, and beyond repair. The logic of glide bomb warfare is unforgiving because It exposes a deeper truth. Once the skies belong to one side, the ground belongs to them too. Ukraine is living that truth every day, and the outcome is no longer in doubt. I've watched armies collapse before. It never happens all at once, and it never looks dramatic until the very end. In the beginning, it looks like exhaustion. Then it looks like improvisation soldiers holding positions with less ammunition, fewer rotations, and equipment that is repaired more often than it's replaced. Eventually, it looks like cancellation of offensives, um, sudden withdrawals, and frantic mobilization laws that scrape the bottom of the demographic barrel. Ukraine has reached that phase. The signs are unmistakable. A military does not run out of shells, barrels, manpower, and strategic depth unless the clock is nearly out. And Ukraine is not just running out of time, it's running out of options. When the war began, Ukraine fielded a large Soviet legacy force with thousands of artillery tubes and vast stockpiles of 122 millimeters and 152 millimeters ammunition. That artillery park is gone. Not because the Ukrainians didn't fight hard, they did, but because modern industrial warfare burns through resources at a rate the West never prepared for. Barrels wear out after a few hundred rounds. Guns must be withdrawn to depots for servicing. Ammunition must be stockpiled in quantities that assume years of sustained high-intensity conflict. Russia prepared for that reality. Ukraine did not, and the West, which promised to backfill Ukraine's shortages, discovered that its own defense industries were shells of their former selves. When a brigadier general in NATO says the scope and scale of violence in Ukraine is beyond the alliance's imagination, that he's admitting something fundamental. NATO didn't plan for a war like this. They imagined short, sharp interventions, air power heavy, logistics light, politically controlled, and limited in duration. Ukraine needed none of that. It needed artillery in the tens of thousands and shells in the millions. It needed reserves that could survive glide bombs and drones. It needed an industrial base capable of absorbing battlefield loss rates the West hasn't seen since the Korean War. Instead, it got a handful of Leopards and Abrams, none of which survived contact with a peer adversary equipped with drones, electronic warfare, and layered air defenses. But even equipment loss is not the primary indicator of collapse. Manpower is a military survives when it can rotate, replenish, and retrain. Ukraine can do none of those things. Every battalion that retreats must be rebuilt from almost nothing. Every newly mobilized soldier requires months of training, which Ukraine no longer has the luxury to provide. Every position that falls to glide bombs must be reoccupied by troops who know they will likely face the same bombardment within hours. That's not rotation. That's recycling human beings into a machine that has already exceeded its design limits. I've watched the rhetoric shift over the past year. At first, Ukrainian officials spoke confidently about counteroffensives and NATO membership. Then they spoke about holding lines and stabilizing fronts. Now they speak about mobilizing women and older men, about shutting borders to draft-age males, about replenishing brigades that exist only on paper. This is not the language of a military preparing to win. It is the language of a military preparing to survive another month. People forget that armies don't collapse because they lose ground. They collapse because their internal systems, logistics, command, morale, replacement break down under cumulative pressure. Glide bombs accelerate that breakdown, but they're not its cause. The cause is structural. Ukraine is trying to sustain a war that its demography, industry, and strategic depth cannot support. Russia is fighting a war it spent years preparing for. Ukraine is fighting a war it was never equipped to endure. This is what a military running out of time looks like. It doesn't explode. It thins, it frays, and then quietly, at first, it gives way. For decades, NATO built its reputation on an illusion, an image of overwhelming power sustained by exercises, simulations, and political confidence. But reputations do not fight wars, armies do. And, and when you strip away the rhetoric, NATO finds itself confronting a harsh truth that has no warfighting army capable of facing Russia in a sustained, high-intensity conflict. I say this not to provoke, but because I spent my career studying both forces. NATO today is a political alliance with impressive budgets and sophisticated hardware, but without the combat experience, industrial depth, or logistical culture required to fight a real war against a peer adversary. Ukraine has exposed this reality more brutally than any military review could. The West became accustomed to wars of choice operations where the enemy had no air defense, no mechanized depth, no electronic warfare, and no ability to shoot back with anything resembling parity. Iraq and Afghanistan were not pure conflicts. They were policing actions with uniforms. Kosovo, often cited as a NATO success, was in truth an operational embarrassment. Serbia had limited air defense, yet NATO struggled to suppress them. Missions were aborted because pilots couldn't find targets. Civilian infrastructure was hit repeatedly because intelligence was thin and battle damage assessment was unreliable. That was NATO at its best. And even then, the alliance nearly broke itself through incompetence. Now imagine that same structure facing Russia, a military that has spent 2 years perfecting the art of integrated, layered, sensor-driven warfare across thousands of kilometers. Russia fights like a nation preparing for a 15-round heavyweight contest. NATO trains like a gym that specializes in exhibition matches. Western pilots boast about their flight hours, but none of those hours involve flying against an opponent with S-400 batteries, long-range air-to-air missiles, or the electronic suppression capabilities Russia employs daily. Western tank crews brag about their platforms, but none of those tanks have trained under conditions where drones hover constantly overhead and artillery strikes respond within minutes. The battlefield has changed. NATO has not. Logistics tell the story even more clearly. During the Cold War, NATO built deep maintenance depot, but the ammunition reserves and multi-division command structures capable of sustaining combat for months. All of that has been dismantled. What remains is a collection of understrength brigades dependent on contractors for essential maintenance. Contractors don't enter contested zones. They don't repair under fire. They don't mobilize overnight to salvage damaged armor. They operate on invoices, not wartime necessity. Russia, by contrast, has massive repair echelons that pull damaged vehicles from the line, fix them, and return them to combat in days. That's how real armies endure. NATO's problems extend beyond logistics. They run deeper into the culture of its armed forces. Modern Western soldiers joined in an era of low intensity conflict where deployments meant convoy patrols, drone overwatch, and carefully choreographed raids. They didn't join expecting to face massed artillery, glide bombs, um, swarm drones, or trench warfare on a scale not seen since the mid 20th century. They joined for education, benefits, and career stability. There is nothing wrong with that, but it is not the mentality required to take sustained punishment from a near peer adversary, an adversary whose soldiers have been fighting, adapting, and surviving under fire for years. This is why the talk of NATO entering the war is fantasy. It is the bravado of politicians who have never watched a brigade dissolve under pressure, never seen an airbase cratered beyond repair, never witnessed an armored thrust stopped cold by layered fires. The truth is simple. NATO does not have the structure, the depth, or the will to fight Russia. Ukraine has shown what this war looks like. NATO cannot pretend it would fare better. Strategy dies the moment a nation begins believing its own narrative. I've seen this more times than I care to remember. Politicians sell a story, the media amplifies it, and institutions shape their planning around assumptions that were never grounded in reality. Ukraine is the product of this cycle taken to the extreme. Western leaders convinced themselves that Russia was weak, isolated, incompetent, and on the verge of collapse. They convinced themselves that sanctions would break Moscow's economy, that NATO weapons would transform Ukraine into an unstoppable force, and that political will could substitute for logistics. They believed all of this because it was comfortable and because it relieved them of the responsibility to confront the hard truth. They never had a strategy to win this war. They had a strategy to avoid losing face. When this conflict began, the West promised Ukraine everything victory. NATO membership, EU accession, long-term security guarantees, and limitless support. But a promise is not a strategy. A slogan is not a plan, and hope is not a substitute for artillery shells. I watched Western officials speak about Ukraine's path to NATO as if they were offering a career opportunity, ignoring the fact that bringing a corrupt, bankrupt, depopulated state into the alliance was never going to happen. They spoke about bridges to membership, even as they knew those bridges led nowhere. It was performative reassurance, not strategic calculation. The illusion deepened when Ukraine launched its much hyped counteroffensive. Western planners assumed that NATO-style combined arms tactics could be grafted onto an army that lacked the air power, engineering capabilities, and logistics required to execute them. Tanks were delivered in token numbers, crews were rushed through training programs, and officers were handed playbooks that presumed air superiority the Ukrainians did not possess. I watched this unfold in disbelief. You can teach a unit how to maneuver. You cannot give it an air force overnight. You cannot shield it from minefields with PowerPoint. And you cannot overcome Russian firepower with a handful of donated platforms painted in NATO camouflage. When the counteroffensive failed, and the West didn't reassess its strategy. It doubled down on rhetoric. Officials blamed weather, terrain, and Ukrainian execution, anything except the fundamental flaw. The West had built its plan on assumptions that had no relation to the battlefield reality. They still speak today as if Ukraine can hold the line or stabilize the front, even though the line no longer exists in any operationally coherent form. They talk about sending F-16 seconds and long-range weapons as if these gestures can reverse the strategic imbalance. This is not a strategy. This is denial dressed up as policy. The truth is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Russia dictates the pace, a scale, and direction of this war. Ukraine reacts. The West observes. And because they cannot change this hierarchy, Western leaders have shifted toward another illusion, the idea of a political end state defined in European conference rooms without Russia present. Peace summits with no Russian delegation are theater, not diplomacy. A war ends when the side with momentum decides it ends, not when the losing side drafts conditions it cannot enforce. Ukraine's fate will not be determined in Brussels or Washington. It will be determined in the villages, trenches, and logistical corridors that Russian glide bombs, artillery, and infantry have already been reduced to rubble. What remains of Western strategy is not a plan for victory, but a struggle to maintain narratives in the face of battlefield arithmetic. The problem is that arithmetic always wins. And once the illusion breaks, it breaks completely. Power is never static. It shifts, bends, and realigns according to the pressures of geography, economics, and military reality. For decades, the West convinced itself that it sat at the center of global power, unchallenged, unrivaled, immune to the consequences it imposed on others. Ukraine has shattered that illusion as well. What is emerging from this conflict is a new geometry of power, one in which the West no longer defines the global center of gravity. Russia, China, Belarus, Iran, and the broader BRICS-aligned states are drawing the lines now. And those lines form a structure the West neither anticipated nor understands. I've spent my life studying adversaries. I've learned that nations reveal their strategic posture not through their rhetoric, but through the alliances they form and the risk they're willing to absorb. Russia's alliance network today is not accidental. It's the product of a decade-long reassessment triggered by NATO expansion, U.S. sanctions, and Washington's belief that pressure could bend Moscow to its will. Instead, that pressure achieved the opposite. It pushed Russia into a strategic partnership with China deeper than any formal treaty. It solidified Belarus as an extension of Russia's defensive perimeter, and it created a political and economic ecosystem where nations targeted by the West gravitate toward Moscow and Beijing, not because they are forced to, but because they no longer trust Western institutions to act in good faith. China's position is especially pivotal. Beijing does not deploy armies lightly and has no interest in reckless confrontation. But China has made something unmistakably clear. If the West attempts to destroy Russia as a state, China will not stand aside. This is an ideological alignment. It's strategic self-preservation. China knows that a weakened or collapsed Russia would push NATO and U.S. strategic power directly up to its borders. So Beijing has anchored its future to a stable, resilient Russia. The result is a combined economic and technological base that dwarfs anything the West can bring to bear. Together, Russia and China are not simply resisting Western pressure. They are shaping an alternative global order. Belarus, though smaller, um, plays a role no less decisive. Minsk has made it plain that if NATO attacks Russia, Belarus will enter the war instantly. There is no ambiguity. This means NATO can no longer view escalation through the narrow lens of Ukraine alone. Any miscalculation expands the war into a multi-front confrontation, and once that happens, the West faces a coalition of states that have trained together coordinated policy and planned for scenarios that Washington dismissed as unrealistic. The geometry of conflict shifts the moment more than one axis of power is involved. Iran's role is subtler but equally significant. Tehran has developed drone and missile capabilities precisely to check Western influence in the Middle East. Those same capabilities now support Russia's industrial base. And Iran has signaled that it will not watch idly if the West attempts to force regime change through military pressure. In a world where the United States once acted as the global enforcer, these nations are signaling that any attack on one risks confrontation with all. That is a fundamental transformation of the strategic landscape. The West is struggling to understand this shift because it still believes in a rules-based order that it authored unilaterally. But the rest of the world is no longer willing to operate under rules applied selectively. They've watched sanctions used as weapons. They've watched assets frozen and seized without legal basis. They've watched military interventions justified under doctrines that change with the political winds. And they've decided quietly at first, openly now, that they will not be subservient to an order that threatens their sovereignty. This is the new geometry of power, decentralized, multipolar, grounded in mutual defense, and anchored by states that have learned to survive Western coercion. Ukraine is not just a battlefield, it is a fault line in a global realignment. And once this realignment solidifies, the world the West thought it controlled will no longer exist. The final days of a war never look like the headlines predict. They don't erupt in dramatic offensives or grand symbolic moments. They unfold quietly, almost mechanically, as the losing side runs out of the essential elements that keep a military alive: ammunition, manpower, mobility, and time. Ukraine is entering that phase. Now, not because its soldiers lacked courage, and not because the West failed to supply enough slogans, but because the fundamentals of war have caught up with a nation asked to fight beyond its means. The glide bombs raining down on Ukrainian positions are not just weapons, they are signals of a strategic truth Ukraine can no longer escape. In these final days, the battlefield becomes strangely predictable. A Russian aircraft release, glide bombs dozens of kilometers from the front line, knowing there is no Ukrainian system left that can reach them. Those bombs glide silently toward trenches, bunkers, and strong points whose coordinates have been verified by drones orbiting overhead. The positions don't disappear instantly. They simply cease to function. Communications break, survivors scatter, and whatever defensive coherence existed evaporates under the shockwave. Russian infantry moves forward methodically, not because they are rushing to raise a flag, but because there is nothing left to stop them. This is not blitzkrieg. It is a demolition, and Ukraine now faces it daily. I've heard Western analysts describe this moment as delicate, as if the right combination of sanctions, speeches, and last-minute weapons deliveries could reverse the trajectory. But wars don't turn on speeches. They turn on the capacity. Ukraine no longer has the ability to sustain a defensive line for more than a few weeks at a time. Every time they rebuild, the Russians map it, target it, and reduce it again. Every time they rotate in fresh units, those units enter positions already registered for strikes. Every time they attempt to consolidate, glide bombs make consolidation impossible. Ukraine is not being outmaneuvered. It is being outlasted. The West doesn't want to face what comes next. For years, Western leaders insisted that Ukraine would negotiate from a position of strength, that Russia would be forced to compromise, and that military pressure would break Moscow's will. None of that has happened. Russia has dictated the tempo, hold, and scope of this war from the moment it suppressed Ukraine's air defenses. And now, as Ukrainian brigades disintegrate faster than they can be rebuilt, the political narrative in the West is collapsing alongside the military one. The collapse itself won't look like a single event. It will look like towns abandoned after unsustainable losses. It will look like brigades that exist only on paper. It will look like mobilization drives scraping for recruits in a population that has already been bled dry. It will look like front lines that bend slowly and then, under one more wave of glide bombs, break completely. Ukrainian officials will speak about tactical withdrawals long after the withdrawals stop being tactical. Western governments will insist that support is flowing even when nothing of significance remains to send. That is how wars conclude, not with clarity, but with denial fading into acceptance. People ask me whether Ukraine's final days will resemble Berlin in 1945. They won't. Russia has no interest in sacrificing lives to storm fortified cities street by street. It doesn't need to. The Ukrainian military no longer has the strength to impose that kind of attrition. Russia will grind forward until there is no organized resistance left, until the political structure in Kyiv is forced to confront what its Western backers refused to admit: the war was lost. The moment Ukraine surrendered the skies, the end game has already begun. The only question that remains is whether Ukraine chooses the path that preserves what's left of its people and its state, or whether it follows the illusions of others into a future that no longer exists.